The horse had been dead on its feet for 2 hours, and Etta Hale knew it was only a matter of time before it quit on her. The wind had come down out of the north like a judgment, the way it does on the high plains when a blue norther decides to erase an entire day in the space of an afternoon. The mercury had fallen 50 degrees since noon. She could feel it in the way the air bit at the back of her throat, in the way her fingers had gone past numb into a faraway ache that no longer seemed to belong to her. She was riding the road that followed the Canadian River west out of Oldham County, and she had no right to be on it. A woman alone, in the worst cold Texas had ever put on the land, with nothing but a dying horse and a coat with something sewn into its lining. The horse had a name, and she had named it herself, and it had carried her 140 miles through weather that had killed stronger things than either of them. Before we go further, settle in wherever you are tonight. We love knowing who is with us, so let us know in the comments where you're listening from. Some of you are reading this with the fire going, and some of you are listening with your hands busy, and wherever that is, we're glad you're here. Now, let me tell you about Etta Hale. She had left her home at first light, the morning the cold came down, and she had not looked back once. Not because she was brave, because looking back was the one thing that would have undone her. The man she was running from had a paper, and the paper said the ranch was his, and the paper was a lie, and she had the truth sewn into the lining of her coat where he would never think to look. Thomas had put it there. Thomas, her husband, who had died in the fall with his right hand crushed under a wagon, and his last words to her about a deed and a river crossing and a man named Jasper who would come for both. The horse stopped. It stood with its head down, blowing, the snow crusting on its mane, and Etta got off it because she knew better than to argue with a creature that had given her everything it had. She walked. The snow was coming now, fine and mean, and the wind drove it sideways so that it felt less like weather and more like something with a purpose. She walked until the horse was a gray shape behind her, and then she kept walking because quitting had never been a word that fit her, and she was too old to start learning it now. She saw the light. Across the river, up on the rise, a window burning yellow against all that white. A light in a storm. She had been told her whole life that she was too stubborn to know when to quit. She supposed this was the night it saved her. The Canadian had skimmed ice over, and she crossed it careful, testing each step, the cold coming up through the soles of her boots. On the far bank, she climbed the rise toward the light, and the light got no smaller, and that was the first thing she had been able to count on in a very long time. The house, when she reached it, was low and built of sod and timber, and the light was in the kitchen window, and a man stood at the door with a rifle in his hand and a lantern in the other, and he did not lower the rifle, and he did not ask her who she was. He said, "Get in." She got in. The warmth hit her like a wall, and she stood dripping in the middle of the kitchen, and the man set the lantern down on the table and went to the stove and came back with a cup of coffee that she took in both hands because her fingers would not bend. He watched her. He had a face that had been used hard, and a stillness to him that made her think of water that had gone too long without moving. "You're a long way from anywhere," he said. "I know it. You got a name?" "Etta Hale." He nodded once, like that settled something. "Gideon Ray. This is my place. You're welcome to the fire, and I'd be obliged if you'd tell me the rest of it when you can." She drank the coffee. It was the best thing she had ever tasted, and she said so, and he didn't answer, and that was all right too. She could hear the wind working at the corners of the house, and she could feel the cold pressing in at the walls like it wanted in, and she thought about the light in the window, burning for a stranger on the worst night of her life, and she thought about the kind of man who would keep a light burning for people he had never met. "Why do you keep it lit?" she asked him. "The light. Out there. A body could see it a mile off." Gideon Ray looked at the window for a long moment, and then he looked back at her, and she saw something move behind his eyes that she recognized, because she carried the same thing herself. "I lost people in a storm," he said. "A long time ago. I was away, and I couldn't get back in time, and when I got home there was nobody left to light it for. So I lit it. Every night since. On the chance that somebody out there in the dark was looking for a way in, the way I was looking, and never found one." He said it without any feeling in it, the way a man says a thing he has said to himself 1,000 times until the words were smooth. Etta set the cup down. She was cold all the way through, and she was tired in a way that had nothing to do with her body, and she said the only thing she could think of that was true. "Then I'm obliged to you, Gideon Ray." because I was out there in the dark, and I found it. The storm came down on them that night like it meant to bury the whole county and start over. It was the 12th of February, and Texas was freezing solid from the panhandle to the Gulf, and the wind drove the snow into drifts that swallowed fence lines, and the river ran black under a skin of ice, and the cold got into places a body didn't know it had. Gideon banked the fire and gave her a blanket that smelled of cedar and a bed in the room that had been a child's room once, and she saw the small bed and the shelf with a wooden horse on it, and she did not ask, and he did not tell her, and they both let the silence stand. She slept. She dreamed of Thomas, alive, with his hand whole, and she woke in the dark with the wind howling and the house groaning, and she lay there and listened to it, and thought about the paper in her coat, and the man named Jasper who would come for it. And she knew he would come for it, because a man like Jasper Hale did not let a thing he wanted go out of his reach. He had wanted the ranch since Thomas died. He had wanted the river crossing that went with it, the one that the railroad men had been asking about, the one that would be worth money when the line came through. He had come to her house in the fall with his paper, and he had laid it on the table, and he had told her to sign, and she had told him no, and he had smiled the way a man smiles when he is sure of the ending. She knew he would come. The only question was whether the storm would keep him away long enough for her to get somewhere safe. She had thought, when she left, that the answer was Tascosa, the county seat, where the records were kept. She had thought she could walk into the courthouse with Thomas's deed and let the law read it and put Jasper's lie to rest. But she had heard things on the road, the way a woman hears things, and what she had heard was that the sheriff in these parts did his business the way Jasper Hale told him to. She had heard that Jasper had bought the law the way he bought everything else, with patience and money and the promise of more. So she had ridden instead of walking into the courthouse. She had ridden into the worst storm in a generation, hoping to outrun a man who did not need to run, because he had the law and the paper and the time. Morning came gray and brutal. The wind had not quit, and the cold had not eased, and Gideon went out to see to his stock and came back with frost on his beard and a kind of quiet anger in him. He fed her. He made her eat. She watched him move around his kitchen, and she saw the way he checked the window, and she saw the way he had hung his rifle by the door, and she understood that a man who kept a light for strangers was also a man who knew strangers could come with the light in their eyes and a knife in their hearts. "You're thinking about him," he said. "Not a question." "I'm thinking about a man who thinks he owns me," she said. "And a paper that says he does. And a sheriff who'll back him." Gideon set his cup down. He looked at her for a long time, and then he said, "You got a choice to make, Etta Hale. You can go on to Tascosa and let the law sort it, and maybe you'll find a man who'll read the deed, and maybe you won't. Or you can stay here, where the law is a rifle by the door and a man who keeps a light burning, and wait for him to come, and meet him on ground you know. And if I stay," she said, "he'll come here, and you'll be in the middle of it. I've been in the middle of worse." "Gideon." She said his name like it cost her something. "You don't know me. You don't know me. You could let me walk out of here and be shut of me, and nobody would think less of you." He was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, "My wife used to say that a body doesn't need to be lost to need a light. She said you can be standing in your own dooryard and still be out in the dark, and the light don't care, it just burns." He looked at her. "You're standing in my dooryard, Etta Hale, and I got a light burning. That's all the knowing I need." She did not have anything to say to that. She sat there with the cold coming in through the walls and the wind working at the corners, and she thought about a man who had lost everything and kept a light burning for strangers ever since, and she thought about the paper in her coat, and she thought about Jasper Hale riding through this storm with the sheriff at his side, and she understood that she had been running towards something her whole life, and she had finally reached it, and it was a man who kept a light burning for people he had never met. She stayed. The storm broke on the third day, and the cold eased, and the world came back out of the white, and Etta went out with Gideon to see the shape of the country he lived in. The river had gone down, and the sun came out weak and thin, and she stood on the bank and looked at the crossing, the one that had been there since the cattle days, the one that the railroad men had been asking about, and she understood why Jasper wanted it. Water. A crossing. A place where a line of steel would one day come, and a man who owned the land on both sides of it would own the future. She had been a rancher's wife long enough to know what that was worth. She had been Thomas's wife long enough to know he had seen it too, and that was why he had filed the deed, and that was why he had put the paper in her coat, and that was why he had named Jasper in his last words, because Thomas had known the same thing she knew, that a man who wanted the future that bad would not stop at a paper. They saw the riders that afternoon, 2 of them, far off across the river, moving slow, and she knew the shape of the first one even at that distance, the way a woman knows the shape of a man who has been trying to own her. Jasper Hale. And beside him, the sheriff. Gideon watched them with her. He did not say anything for a long time, and then he said, "You could still ride for Tascosa. It's a hard ride, but it's a fair one, and the cour is open." "And if I do," she said, "he'll be here behind me, and he'll have the sheriff, and he'll have the paper, and he'll have the time. And when I come back, it'll be his place, and I'll have nothing." "Then what will you do?" "I'll stay," she said, "and I'll meet him on ground I know. Like you said." He looked at her, and something in his face changed, and she could not name it, and he said, "That's the stubbornest thing I ever heard a woman say, and I've heard some." "It's the stubbornest thing I ever been," she said. "It's all I got." They watched the riders come on, slow and sure, and the sun went down behind them, and the cold came back up out of the river, and Gideon lit the lantern and set it in the window, and Etta stood at the glass and watched the 2 men make camp across the river, and she thought about the paper in her coat, and she thought about Thomas's crushed hand, and she thought about the doctor in Tascosa who had seen it, and she thought about how a lie is only a lie until a truth walks in and sits down beside it. Jasper Hale came across the river the next morning, and he came alone, and he came with the sheriff behind him, and he came the way a man comes when he is sure of the ending. He was a tall man, handsome in a way that wore on you, and he wore a coat that had cost more than the ranch he was trying to take, and he smiled when he saw Etta standing in the dooryard, and the smile did not reach his eyes. "Well, Etta," he said, "you led me on a chase." "I didn't lead you anywhere, Jasper. I left, and here I found you." He looked past her at the house, at Gideon standing in the door with the rifle in his hand, and he looked at the lantern in the window, and he said, "You've made yourself comfortable. I'm glad. It'll make what comes next easier on you." "What comes next," she said, "is you turning around and riding back where you came from." Jasper laughed. He had a laugh that was smooth and unhurried, the laugh of a man who had never once in his life had to hurry. "I'll tell you what comes next, Etta. The sheriff here has a paper, and the paper says that your husband, God rest him, signed over the ranch to me into the fall, owing me money he couldn't pay. And the paper's got his mark on it, and the mark's witnessed, and the law's going to honor it, because the law honors what's written. And you're going to sign a quitclaim, and you're going to walk away from this place with what you came in with, which is nothing, and I'm going to be reasonable about it, because I'm a reasonable man." "Thomas never signed that paper," she said. "Thomas is dead," Jasper said, "and dead men don't argue." The sheriff stepped forward. He was a heavy man with a tired face, and he held the paper out, and she could see the mark on it from where she stood, and then she could see that it was a mark, not a signature, and she knew what she knew. She had been Thomas's wife for 11 years. She had washed his clothes and fed his stock and buried his body. She knew what his hand looked like on a page, and she knew that after the wagon fell on him, his right hand was crushed past the wrist, and in that he had not signed anything in the last month of his life, and in that he had died without ever holding a pen again. "That's not his mark," she said. "It's witnessed," Jasper said. "It's witnessed by a man who was there." "There was no man there, Jasper. There was me. I was there. I was with him when he died, and his hand was broke, and he never signed a thing, and you know it, and the doctor in Tascosa knows it. And if you put that paper in front of a court, I'll bring the doctor, and I'll bring the neighbors, and I'll tell them how you came to my house in the fall with your paper and your smile, and I'll tell them how you told me to sign or be sorry." Jasper's smile did not move. "And who will believe you, Etta? A woman alone, who ran off in the night with a dead man's coat, or the sheriff, and the paper, and me?" "The doctor," she said. "The doctor will believe me, because he set Thomas's hand, and he'll swear to it, and a court will hear him." The sheriff looked at the paper in his hand, and then he looked at Etta, and she saw something move in his tired face, and she did not know what it was, and then Jasper spoke again, smooth as ever. "Here's the truth of it, Etta. I don't need the court. I've got the paper, and I've got the law, and I've got the winter. You've got a dead man's word and a coat full of nothing. So here's my offer, and I'll only make it once. You sign the quitclaim, and you ride out of here with the clothes on your back, and I'll forget the trouble you've put me to. You don't sign, and the sheriff arrests you for theft of the paper, and we do this the hard way, and I promise you, you'll wish you'd signed." Gideon stepped out of the door. He had the rifle in his hand, and he walked down into the dooryard, and he stood beside Etta, and he did not raise the rifle, and he did not shout, and he said, in his quiet way, "She's not signing anything, Jasper, and she's not going anywhere with you." Jasper looked at him the way a man looks at a piece of furniture that has spoken. "I don't know you, Gideon Ray. This is my place, and she's under my roof, and that makes her my concern." "Your concern?" Jasper said, and he laughed again. "You've got a rifle, and you've got a lantern, and you've got a dead man's widow under your roof, and you think that makes you something. Mister, I've bought and sold men bigger than you before breakfast. You're going to step aside, and I'm going to take my property, and we're going to be done with this." "You're not taking her," Gideon said. The sheriff cleared his throat. "Mr. Ray," he said, "I've got the law here, and I'd hate to see you on the wrong side of it." "You've got a paper," Gideon said, "and a paper's only as good as the truth behind it. And the truth is, this woman's husband died with his hand broke, and he never signed anything, and you know it, and I know it, and Jasper knows it, and the only question is whether you're going to be the kind of man who enforces a lie." The sheriff's face went still. He looked at the paper, and he looked at Etta, and he looked at Jasper, and she could see him thinking, and she could see the weight of it settling on him, and she knew that a man can carry a lie for a long time, but there comes a moment when the truth sits down beside him and the lie gets heavy. Then Jasper moved. He moved fast, the way a man who is sure of the ending moves, and he had a gun in his hand that had not been there a moment before, and he leveled it at Gideon, and the dooryard went very quiet, and the wind went out of the world, and Etta Hale stood in the cold and looked at the man who had been trying to own her, and she did not flinch. "Now," Jasper said, "you're going to step aside, or I'm going to put a hole in you and take her anyway, and it'll be your own doing." Gideon did not move. He did not raise the rifle. He stood there in the dooryard with the cold coming up out of the ground, and he said, "You've got a gun on me, Jasper. That's the only thing you've got. And I've got a light burning in my window, and I've got a woman standing behind me, and I've got the truth. And I've buried my whole family in a storm, and I've got nothing left that you can take, and that makes me the most dangerous man you've ever pointed a gun at." The words sat in the dooryard like a stone. Jasper's smile flickered, and then, from the road, there came the sound of riders, and the sheriff turned, and Etta turned, and coming up the river road were the neighbors, Mrs. Odom in the lead with her husband and her boys, and behind them the storekeeper and the blacksmith and the men from the 2 ranches upriver, and they had heard, and they had come. Jasper's gun did not go down, but the sheriff's hand did, and the sheriff looked at Jasper, and he said, "Put it up, Jasper." "It's done." "It's not done," Jasper said. "I've got the paper." "You've got a forgery," the sheriff said, "and I've got a doctor who'll swear to it, and I've got a dooryard full of witnesses, and I've got a woman who's been telling the truth while you've been telling me a story. Put it up." Jasper looked at the riders, and he looked at the sheriff, and he looked at Gideon, and he looked at Etta, and for the first time in his life, she saw him do the math and come up short. And she watched the smoothness leave his face, and she watched the smile die, and she watched the man who had been sure of the ending understand that the ending had changed. He put the gun up. The sheriff took the paper. He read it, and he looked at the mark on it, and he folded it and put it in his coat, and he said, "We'll sort this out in Tascosa, Jasper. You and me and the doctor. And if it's what I think it is, you'll be sorting it out from a cell." Jasper looked at Etta then, and his eyes were flat and cold, and he said, "This isn't over, Etta." "It is," she said. "It's been over since the day you came to my house with your lie. You just didn't know it yet." They took him across the river. The neighbors stood in the dooryard and watched, and then they turned to Etta, and Mrs. Odom came up and took her hands. And Mrs. Odom was a woman who had called her a stranger and worse when she had arrived, and now she stood there with tears on her face and said, "We heard. We heard what he did, and we came. We should have come sooner. We should have believed you sooner." "You came," Etta said. "That's what matters." The dooryard emptied. The sun went down, and the cold came back, and Gideon lit the lantern and set it in the window, and they stood in the kitchen with the fire going, and the house was quiet, and the wind had gone down, and the world outside had gone still and white and clean. She tended his hands. He had burned them on the stove rope and on the harness. And she sat him down at the table and took the salve from the shelf and worked it into the raw places. And he let her, and neither of them spoke, and the quiet was not the kind of quiet that needed filling. You lost your family, she said. Not a question. Wife and a boy, he said. Caleb. He was 7. The winter of '86. The big die-up winter. I was up the river with the cattle, and the storm come down, and I couldn't get back, and when I got home they were gone. They'd gone out to bring in the stock, and the storm caught them, and they never made it back to the light. She kept working the salve into his hands. And you've been lighting it ever since. Every night. For strangers. For anybody out there in the dark, he said. Looking for a way in. The way I was looking, and never found one. She looked up at him then, and she said the thing she had been carrying since the night she crossed the river, and she said it quiet, the way you say a thing you mean with your whole life. I kept the light burning for strangers, she said. And you're the first one who ever stayed. He looked at her, and something in his face gave way, the way ice gives way on a river in the spring, and he said, I've been alone a long time, Etta Hale. I'd forgotten what it felt like to have somebody stand in the dooryard and not leave. You're not alone, she said. You haven't been since the night you lit that light for a woman you'd never met. If this story is moving you, you are exactly who we wrote it for. A like and a subscribe tells us to keep going, and it means more than you know. Take a breath. We're almost home. The days passed, and the world came back to life. The river rose with the thaw, and the ice went out, and the neighbors came and went, and the story of the dooryard spread up and down the Canadian, the way such stories do, and Jasper Hale sat in a cell in Tascosa and watched his paper turn to ash in the hands of a court that had finally heard the truth. The doctor swore. The neighbors swore. Mrs. Odom swore. And the man who had bought and sold men before breakfast found out that there are some things money cannot buy, and the first of them is a woman's word when she has the truth behind it. The railroad men came in the spring, and they walked the crossing, and they talked to Gideon, and they talked to Etta, and they made an offer for the right of way, and Gideon and Etta looked at each other across the dooryard, and they took the offer, and they used it to buy the land on the other side of the river, the land Jasper had been reaching for, the land that would have made him the future. And so the future that Jasper had tried to steal came to them instead, and the man who had been sure of the ending ended up with nothing, and the woman who had been told her whole life that she was too stubborn to know when to quit found out that stubborn was the only thing that had ever saved her. They married in the fall, in Tascosa, in the courthouse where the deed had been read and the lie had died. Mrs. Odom cried. The sheriff, who had found his conscience in a dooryard, stood up with them, and Gideon Ray, who had kept a light burning for strangers for 13 years, stood in the core and looked at Etta Hale and understood that the light had not been burning for strangers at all. It had been burning for her. It had been burning for the night she would cross the river, and the storm would blow her in, and he would finally have somebody to light it for. The years went by, and the light never went out. The railroad came through, and the crossing became a station, and the station became a town, and the town grew up around the 2 ranches like it had been waiting for them. Gideon's boy's wooden horse came down off the shelf and stood on the mantel in the new house, and the child's bed became a guest bed, and the room that had held a grief for 13 years held a life instead. And every night, winter and summer, in storm and in clear, the lantern burned in the window, and then it was not a beacon anymore. It was a home. On a spring evening, years later, Etta Hale stood at the kitchen window and watched the light go on in the window across to the yard, where Gideon was seeing to the horses, and she thought about the night she had crossed the river with nothing but a dead man's coat and a paper sewn into its lining, and she thought about the wind that had tried to blow her out of the world for 3 days, and she smiled, because the wind had never once managed it. The wind had been trying to blow her out of the world for 3 days. In the end, all it did was blow her home. Next, we'll tell you the story of a deaf woman who was sent to a remote ranch because her family was ashamed of her, and the blind rancher who could see her worth from the moment she arrived. Until then, be good to each other and keep a light burning. You never know who's out there in the dark, looking for a way in.